There is a game out there where machines have already won, where Earth has already been lost, and where the only people brave or desperate enough to go back down are the ones we call raiders. And tonight we're going to piece together every fragment of lore the game has given us to figure out if something intelligent is sitting at the center of all of it. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So, a quick word from me as the person who put this video together. I have been sitting with the lore of Ark Raiders for a long time now, going through environmental details, item descriptions, loading screen text, dialogue fragments, and everything in between. What I wanted to do with this video was take all of those pieces and arrange them in a way that actually tells a story rather than just listing facts, one after another. The choice I made that you might notice is that I deliberately reordered some of the lore elements to build toward the central question of whether Ark has a guiding intelligence behind it. Some of the environmental detail comes later than it might chronologically, because I think it hits harder once you understand the human side of the story first. That was a deliberate call. Everything in here is my interpretation of the lore, and I want to be clear about that. This is one reading of the evidence. The game itself leaves a lot open, so let us get into it. Chapter 1. Before the Fall, Earth as it was. To understand what Ark did to Earth, you first have to understand what Earth was before Ark showed up. And this is where the lore gets interesting right away, because the game does not spend a lot of time painting a picture of the old world in any kind of romantic way. The fragments we have of the pre-Ark world suggest a civilization that was complicated, uneven, and deeply divided along lines of resources and access. This was not a golden age that got ripped away. It was a messy, struggling world that got interrupted before it ever got a chance to sort itself out. The environmental storytelling in the game's drop zones points toward a world that was heavily industrialized right up until the end. You see factories that were still running, infrastructure projects that were mid-completion, supply chains that were clearly straining under pressure. One reading of this is that Earth's population in the years before the Ark event was pushing harder and harder against the limits of what the planet could sustain. The machines and manufacturing that Ark later repurposed were not relics of some distant past. They were contemporary. They were things people were using last Tuesday in the world's timeline. What is particularly striking about the pre-Ark world lore is how it suggests that governments and major institutions were not entirely caught off guard by the possibility of some kind of catastrophic event. There are hints scattered through item descriptions and environmental notes that evacuation planning had existed in some form. The orbital infrastructure that humanity fled to did not appear overnight. Those stations, those platforms, those habitats above the clouds had been in development and in use. The question the lore raises, though, is who those stations were built for, and the answer to that seems to be not everyone. The class divisions of the old world map almost perfectly onto the divisions you see among the station populations in the present day of the game. The people who had access to resources, to connections, to the right kind of credentials, those people made it up. The people who did not have those things, many of them did not. The lore does not spell this out in big obvious terms, but it is there in the details, in the way certain factions speak about who they represent and who they're fighting for, in the way raiders talk about what they lost down on the surface. There is something the game suggests about the nature of work in the pre-Ark world that I find genuinely interesting. The infrastructure that Ark eventually occupied was largely industrial in nature. Factories, processing plants, extraction facilities, logistics networks. The game points toward a world where enormous amounts of human labour had already been directed toward building exactly the kind of mechanical and industrial systems that Ark would later absorb. In a sense, and I want to be careful not to overstate this, Humans had already been building Ark's future kingdom before Ark ever arrived. The cities that you can partially observe in the game's environments were dense and layered. There is evidence of rapid construction, of older neighbourhoods being built over or built around, of infrastructure that had been patched and repurposed multiple times before Ark arrived and repurposed it once more. The world that Ark fell upon was already a world of layers, a world where the new kept getting stacked on top of the old, without the old ever being fully cleared away. One of the things I find compelling about the pre-Ark lore fragments is how ordinary they feel. You find references to things like supply deliveries, maintenance schedules, personnel rosters, building permits, the mundane texture of a civilization that was simply going about its business. And then Ark arrived, and all of that ordinary machinery of daily life just stopped. The schedules became irrelevant. The rosters became lists of the missing or the fled. The maintenance went undone. And Ark moved into the resulting silence. The natural world of pre-Ark Earth is not ignored by the lore either. There are references to environmental conditions, to landscapes that had been significantly altered by decades of industrial activity. The Earth that Ark landed on was not a pristine wilderness. It was already marked, already shaped, already partially converted from one thing into another. This makes it harder to draw a clean line between what Ark did to the world and what humanity had already been doing to it. The technology level of pre-Ark Earth is particularly worth paying attention to. The game suggests a world that had reached a fairly high degree of automation and robotics development. Not science fiction levels, not flying cars and personal spacecraft, but a world where automated systems, AI-assisted logistics, and large-scale mechanical infrastructure were simply part of everyday life. This matters because it means Ark did not arrive into a world of manual labour and wooden carts. It arrived into a world that already had the skeleton of a machine civilization in place. The political situation in the years before Ark is only hinted at, but those hints suggest fragmentation rather than unity. Multiple power blocks, competing interests, resource conflicts that had been simmering for years. There is a reading of the lore that suggests some of the delay in a unified response to Ark's arrival was not just a matter of the event happening too fast for anyone to react. It was also a matter of the institutions that would have needed to coordinate that response not actually being in the habit of working together effectively. The social fabric of pre-Ark Earth, as glimpsed through the lore, had already been fraying in ways that would become significant later. The communities that you see the traces of in the game's environments were often insular, defined by their specific economic function or their geographic location. This meant that when Ark arrived, there was no single coherent human response. There were many different responses from many different groups, and they did not always align. Healthcare, education, housing, the basic infrastructure of a society that takes care of its members, all of these things appear in the background lore as systems that were stressed. Not collapsed, but stressed. The game does not turn the pre-Ark world into a dystopia, exactly, but it also does not romanticize it. One reading is that the creators wanted players to understand that what was lost was not paradise. What was lost was something complicated and imperfect, but it was ours and Ark took it. The food production systems visible in the game's environments suggest a world that had been pushing toward greater and greater centralization of agriculture and food supply chains. Large-scale processing facilities, extensive storage networks, the kind of infrastructure that is efficient under normal conditions and extremely fragile when those conditions change. Ark, whatever its ultimate purpose, certainly understood how to target the systems that mattered most. Communication infrastructure is another element that the lore touches on. The pre-Ark world had an extensive, globally interconnected communication network. When Ark arrived, one of the first things that fragmented was the ability of different human groups to coordinate and share information. This is not just the chaos of a sudden catastrophe. The lore suggests that Ark's presence had specific disruptive effects on communication systems, either by accident or by design. The personal stories glimpsed through item descriptions and environmental fragments are what really bring the pre-Ark world to life. A birthday card left in an abandoned apartment, a work order for routine equipment maintenance that was never completed, a shopping list on someone's kitchen counter, perfectly mundane, frozen in the moment before the world changed. These are the details that the game uses most effectively, and they point toward a world that was full of ordinary people living ordinary lives right up until the moment they were not. Education and the transmission of knowledge were clearly important in the pre-Ark world, based on the libraries, archives, and data storage facilities you can find in the game's environments. The lore suggests a civilization that placed significant value on recording and preserving information. The bitter irony is that much of that recorded knowledge is now accessible only to people willing to descend to the surface of a machine-occupied planet to retrieve it. The military and law enforcement infrastructure of the pre-Ark world appears in the game's environments in ways that tell a specific story. These were not small-scale, local operations. The evidence suggests significant standing military forces, large-scale weapons stockpiles, and extensive defensive infrastructure. None of it was enough. The lore does not say this triumphantly or despairingly. It simply presents the evidence and lets you draw the conclusion. What happened in the actual final days of the pre-Ark world, the days during and immediately after Ark's initial arrival, is one of the most fragmented and contested areas of the lore. The game gives you pieces, but deliberately not a complete picture. Different sources within the game describe the same events differently, emphasizing different aspects, placing responsibility differently. This is one of the most interesting structural choices in how the lore is presented. There is no single authoritative account of what happened when Ark came. There are only the accounts of survivors. The children of the pre-Ark world are almost entirely absent from the game's environments, and I think this absence is itself a piece of lore. Either the evacuation to the orbital stations was thorough enough that families and children were among those who made it out, or the alternative is darker. The game does not commit to an answer, but the question hangs over the environments in a way that is hard to shake. The animals of the pre-Ark world are similarly absent in most of the game's environments, or rather, they have been replaced. The Ark entities that roam the surface fill certain ecological niches in a distorted way, occupying spaces where animals once moved, responding to environmental triggers the way animals once did. This is one of the more unsettling aspects of the game's world design, and the lore suggests it may be more than just aesthetic. The energy systems of the pre-Ark world were significant and diverse. The environments contain evidence of power generation facilities, distribution networks, storage systems. Energy was clearly both abundant and contested in the pre-Ark world. Ark's relationship to these energy systems is something the lore raises but does not fully explain. The machines consume energy, generate it, redirect it. Understanding what Ark does with the energy infrastructure of the planet is one of the longer threads the lore asks you to pull on. Transportation networks are visible in the game's environments in a way that tells a story of a highly mobile civilization. Roads, rail, logistics hubs, intermodal transfer facilities. People and goods moved constantly in the pre-Ark world, and the infrastructure built to support that movement is now occupied by something else entirely. The roads are still there, the rails are still there, but who uses them now and for what purpose is a question the lore of Ark Raiders explores in genuinely interesting ways. The archives and bureaucratic records left behind in the game's environments tell a story of a civilization that was deeply committed to documentation and record keeping. Everything was logged, catalogued, filed, and retained. In a strange way, this means that the pre-Ark world is more legible to us as players than it might otherwise be. Ark did not destroy all the paperwork. The paperwork is still there, in filing cabinets, in server rooms, in the dusty offices of organizations that no longer exist. And reading that paperwork is one of the ways the game tells its story most effectively. The entertainment and cultural artifacts left in the pre-Ark world suggest a population that was creative, diverse, and often searching for meaning or escape. Music players, sports equipment, art supplies, books, games. The cultural texture of the pre-Ark world is one that the game renders with enough specificity to feel real without becoming nostalgic or sentimental. These were people who had hobbies and interests and tastes. And then Ark came. The scientific research visible in various pre-Ark environments suggests a civilization that was actively trying to understand its world. Research stations, laboratories, data collection systems. The game hints at ongoing projects in areas that range from environmental monitoring to materials science to biological research. Some of these research threads connect to Ark in ways that are deliberately left ambiguous. Did any pre-Ark research actually touch on what was coming? The lore suggests possibly yes. The implications of that suggestion are significant. The religious and philosophical artifacts of the pre-Ark world appear occasionally in the game's environments, and they are presented without judgment or mockery. Shrines, symbols, texts. The pre-Ark world had people who were searching for meaning in spiritual and philosophical frameworks. What happened to those frameworks when Ark arrived is a thread the lore handles carefully. Some of the faction beliefs that you see in the present-day game world appear to have roots in pre-Ark traditions that were adapted and transformed under the pressure of the new reality. The class structure of the pre-Ark world, as I mentioned earlier, is perhaps the single most important context for understanding the post-Ark world. Who made it to the stations, who did not, why those decisions were made, and who made them. All of these questions connect directly back to the social and economic hierarchies of the world before. The lore does not pretend that the orbital stations are a fresh start for humanity. They are a continuation, with all the baggage and inequity of what came before, just located a few hundred kilometers higher. The specific geography of the areas that the game lets you explore on Earth's surface tells its own story. These were not randomly chosen locations. They were important nodes in the pre-Ark world's infrastructure, places where significant industrial or commercial or logistical activity was concentrated. And they were apparently important to Ark as well, because Ark moved into these locations and stayed. Whatever Ark is doing on Earth's surface, it is doing it in the places that were already important to humanity. That alignment is one of the central mysteries of the lore. The weather and environmental conditions in the game's drop zones suggest that Earth's climate systems have continued to operate independently of Ark's occupation. Storms still come, rain still falls, the seasons, or something like them, still turn. Ark has not transformed Earth into a completely alien environment. The planet's fundamental systems are still running, but they are running around and through Ark's presence, not in opposition to it. This coexistence of natural systems and machine occupation is one of the more quietly unnerving aspects of the game's world. The decay patterns visible in the pre-Ark world's abandoned structures tell a story of time that is worth paying attention to. Some things have decayed significantly, others have been maintained or altered by Ark's presence in ways that slow or redirect that decay. The game's environments are not uniformly post-apocalyptic in the way you might expect. Some areas feel almost preserved, as if Ark's activity has incidentally kept certain structures stable. Others have collapsed or been consumed entirely. The pattern of what Ark preserves and what it lets decay is one of the lore threads I find most interesting. The communications left behind by people in the final days before the evacuation are some of the most emotionally resonant pieces of the game's lore. Messages to family members, instructions left for no one in particular, plans that were never carried out. The human voice in these fragments is immediate and real in a way that no amount of world-building exposition can match. The game uses these fragments wisely, scattering them through environments where they punctuate the larger story with something personal and specific. The question of what happened to people who could not or did not evacuate is one the lore handles with restraint. The game does not show you graphic evidence of mass death. It shows you absence, empty spaces where people should be, belongings left behind, interrupted activities. The horror is in the negative space, not in explicit imagery. And this restraint is, I think, one of the most effective choices the game makes in conveying the scale of what Ark's arrival meant for the people who were not in a position to leave. The relationship between the pre-Ark world and the current Raider community is complex. Raiders are not simply people who remember the old world and are trying to get it back. Many of the active Raiders in the game's lore were born on the stations after the evacuation. They know the old world only through stories, records, and the physical evidence they encounter on their descents. This generational distance from the world before is something the lore acknowledges, and it shapes how different characters relate to what they find down below. The economic systems of the pre-Ark world left behind a physical legacy that is now central to the Raider economy. The resources that Ark has occupied, the components and materials that Raiders descend to retrieve, these are all products of pre-Ark industrial and commercial activity. The things that Ark is surrounded by are the things that humanity made. And the Raiders are, in a sense, harvesting the remains of their own civilization's output. The data centers and server infrastructure visible in the game's environments represent what might be the most significant lost legacy of the pre-Ark world. Enormous amounts of human knowledge, creative output, and historical record are stored in facilities that are now inside Ark-occupied territory. The value that the station communities place on data recovery missions reflects an understanding that what is down there is not just scrap. It is the accumulated intellectual and cultural heritage of the world before. And Ark is sitting on top of it. The pre-Ark world's relationship with automation and artificial intelligence is a thread that the lore asks you to think about carefully. The world before Ark had already developed significant AI-assisted systems. The boundary between human decision-making and automated process was already blurry in many sectors. When Ark arrived, it arrived into a world that had already spent considerable time thinking about and implementing various forms of machine intelligence. Whether that prior experience helped or hurt humanity's ability to understand what Ark was is one of the open questions the lore raises. The agricultural and food production infrastructure visible in the game's environments is a particularly poignant element of the pre-Ark world lore. Fields, processing facilities, storage systems, all sitting idle or repurposed under Ark's occupation. The basic machinery of feeding a civilization, now serving a very different purpose. The lore does not explain exactly what Ark does with food production infrastructure, but the fact that it occupies these spaces at all is noteworthy. The water management systems of the pre-Ark world are another element that the lore touches on in interesting ways. Dams, treatment facilities, distribution networks. Water was clearly both vital and carefully managed in the pre-Ark world. Ark's occupation of these systems is one of the factors that makes the surface effectively uninhabitable for humans without significant equipment and preparation. Whether Ark's relationship with the water systems is intentional or incidental is again something the lore leaves open. The medical facilities visible in pre-Ark environments tell a story of a civilization that had developed significant capabilities for treating illness and injury, and that was also, clearly, not applying those capabilities equally or universally. The equipment in these facilities is often high-tech. The access records and patient logs, where they are legible, suggest a population that had unequal access to that technology. The health infrastructure of the pre-Ark world, like so much else, reflected the inequalities of the society that built it. The educational institutions visible in the game's environments range from small local schools to what appear to be large research universities. The lore does not dwell on these spaces extensively, but their presence grounds the pre-Ark world in something recognizable. These were places where people learned, where knowledge was transmitted from one generation to the next, where the skills and understanding that built the pre-Ark world's infrastructure were cultivated. They are empty now. The transmission has moved to the stations, carried in the memories and the records that people brought with them when they fled. The leisure and recreational infrastructure of the pre-Ark world, sports facilities, parks, entertainment venues, tells a story of a population that had at least some time and space for things beyond mere survival. These are the spaces that feel most achingly empty in the game's environments. They were built for congregation, for shared experience, for the kind of social life that makes a civilization something more than just an economic system. And they are some of the quietest, most undisturbed spaces in the game world because Ark has no apparent use for them. The religious sites and cultural monuments of the pre-Ark world appear occasionally in the game's environments and are treated with a quiet kind of respect. These were places that communities had built to mark what they found significant, to commemorate what they wanted to remember, to articulate something about their values and their understanding of the world. Ark does not appear to have targeted these spaces specifically. They survive or fall like everything else, according to the logic of Ark's occupation, rather than any judgment about their cultural significance. The transportation of the pre-Ark world was not just roads and rails. The environments hint at extensive aerial and maritime infrastructure as well. Airports, ports, logistics networks that moved goods and people across the planet on a scale and at a speed that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. All of that movement has stopped, at least for humans. The surface is still, at least from the perspective of human activity, but Ark moves through it, and the old transportation infrastructure appears to serve new purposes in Ark's occupation of the surface. The final image I want to leave you with for this chapter is this. The pre-Ark world was a world in motion, a world of constant activity, constant change, constant human presence, making itself felt across every surface and through every system. And then Ark came, and all of that motion stopped, or rather, it was replaced by a different kind of motion. The world is still busy. The world is still full of activity and movement and process, but none of it is human anymore. The silence that humans experience when they descend to the surface is not really silence. It is the sound of a world that has moved on without them. The machines are active, the systems are running, something is happening down there. And the central question of this entire video, the question that all of this context has been building toward is, what exactly is that something? And is it being directed by anything we would recognize as a mind? Chapter 2. The Arrival, How Ark Came to Earth. The arrival of Ark is not described in any single definitive account within the game's lore. This is, I think, a very deliberate choice by the developers. The absence of a clean, authoritative origin story for Ark is itself a piece of information. In a world with as much documentation and record-keeping as the pre-Ark world clearly had, the fact that the arrival of Ark produced no single coherent account suggests something about the nature of the arrival itself. What the lore does give us are fragments. Different survivors, different communities, different factions on the stations above all have their own version of what happened when Ark came. These versions agree on some basic points and diverge significantly on others. Assembling them into something coherent requires a certain amount of interpretive work, and I want to be upfront that what follows is my reading of those fragments, not a statement of definitive canon. The most consistent element across the different accounts of Ark's arrival is its speed. Whatever Ark was when it arrived, it moved faster than anyone was prepared for. The various planning and preparedness frameworks that human institutions had developed for potential catastrophic events were not calibrated for something that happened as quickly as Ark's establishment on the surface apparently did. This speed is one of the things that distinguishes Ark from the threats that humanity had previously prepared for. The physical nature of Ark's arrival is described differently by different sources. Some accounts suggest a descent from above, something coming down from space or from outside the atmosphere. Others suggest a more diffuse emergence, as if Ark coalesced or activated from elements that were already present. These two readings are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and the law points towards the possibility that Ark's arrival involved both an external component coming in and something happening to existing systems on the ground. The initial impact of Ark's arrival was not uniform across the planet. The law suggests that certain regions and certain types of infrastructure were affected early and severely, while others had more time. The pattern of what got hit first is one of the things that various factions in the game interpret very differently. Some see it as random, others see it as deliberate targeting. The evidence within the game's environments is genuinely ambiguous on this point, which is frustrating in the most productive way. The human military response to Ark's initial arrival is something the lore touches on, and the picture it paints is not flattering to the effectiveness of that response. It is not that people did not try to fight back. They did. The evidence of that fighting is visible in the game's environments, in damaged structures, in the remains of defensive positions, in the scattered remnants of equipment that was brought to bear against something that it was not designed to stop. The response was real. It was just not effective. One of the most interesting aspects of the arrival lore is what it suggests about how Ark's initial establishment on the surface proceeded. The lore points toward Ark not simply destroying everything in its path, but rather occupying, absorbing, redirecting. The infrastructure of the pre-Ark world was not just obliterated. A significant portion of it was incorporated into Ark's presence on the surface. This is one of the reasons why the game's environments feel the way they do, like occupied spaces rather than destroyed ones. The communication breakdown that accompanied Ark's arrival is a thread the lore returns to repeatedly. Humanity's ability to coordinate a response was severely compromised early in the Ark event. Different communities and institutions found themselves cut off from each other at precisely the moment when coordination was most needed. Whether this communication disruption was a feature of Ark's arrival or a bug, whether it was targeted or incidental, is one of the questions the lore raises without fully answering. The evacuation to the orbital stations that humanity undertook during and after Ark's arrival was not a single organized event. The lore makes this clear. It was a series of departures, some planned and some desperate, from different locations at different times using different means. The station communities that exist in the game's present are the product of these different evacuation streams, each with their own story of how they got out, who they left behind, and what they managed to bring with them. The people who were involved in organizing the evacuations are figures that the lore treats with some complexity. They were not simple heroes. They made difficult decisions about who could be accommodated on limited transport, about which resources were worth prioritizing, about how much time could be spent on any given location before the window closed. The moral weight of those decisions is something that different factions in the game carry very differently. The timeline of Ark's establishment on the surface, as best as the lore lets us reconstruct it, suggests a period of initial intense activity followed by something more like a sustained, steady state. Ark did not just arrive and immediately create the world the game presents. There was a process of occupation, of transformation, of what looks in retrospect like the building of something. though what exactly is being built remains unclear. The role of the existing machine and automation infrastructure in Ark's initial establishment is one of the lore threads I find most compelling. The pre-Ark world's automated systems, its industrial robots, its logistics automation, its various AI-assisted processes, did not simply shut down when Ark arrived. There is evidence suggesting that at least some of these systems were incorporated into or redirected by Ark's presence. The pre-existing machine infrastructure of the pre-Ark world may have made Ark's rapid establishment on the surface significantly easier than it would otherwise have been. The scientists and researchers who were present during Ark's arrival and who survived long enough to record their observations produced what may be the most technically detailed accounts of what happened. These accounts are fragmented and scattered through the game's environments in data logs, damaged reports, and partial records. They do not agree on everything, but they provide a level of observational specificity that the more narrative survivor accounts lack. Assembling them is like doing a puzzle where you are not sure you have all the pieces and the picture on the box is gone. The emotional register of the arrival accounts, the way survivors describe what they experienced and felt, is something I find genuinely moving about the lore. There is fear, obviously. There is confusion. There is the particular horror of watching something familiar become something alien, of seeing a known world rapidly transform into something that cannot be navigated by the same rules. But there is also, in some accounts, something like wonder, a recognition that what was happening was extraordinary, that they were witnessing something that no previous human framework was adequate to describe. The children who were present during Ark's arrival are mentioned in some survivor accounts in ways that are quietly devastating. Not graphically, not sensationally, but in the way that small specific details can carry enormous weight. A child asking a question that no adult knows how to answer. A child's drawing left on a table in an evacuated space. The presence of children in these accounts is one of the things that keeps the lore grounded in human experience, rather than drifting into abstraction. The role of luck in who survived and who did not during Ark's arrival is a theme that the lore handles honestly. There were people who were better positioned, who had access to resources and options that others did not. But even among the well-resourced, survival during Ark's arrival involved a significant element of luck. Being in the right place, making the right call in the moment, having a piece of equipment that happened to work when needed. The survivors of Ark's arrival do not all have triumphant stories of preparation and competence. Many of them have survivors' stories, which is a different thing. The first raiders, the people who began going back down to the surface after the evacuation, were not immediately the organised professional community that the raider culture has since become. The early descents were chaotic, desperate, improvised. People went down because they had to, because something needed to be retrieved, because someone could not accept that what was down there was simply gone. The institutionalization of raiding, the development of it into a profession with its own culture and ethics and organizational structures, came later. But those early desperate descents are the seed from which all of that grew. The question of what Ark actually is in terms of its fundamental nature begins to take shape in the arrival lore. The different accounts disagree on the details, but they collectively point towards something that is not quite like anything in humanity's prior experience or imagination. It is not the alien invasion of old science fiction. It is not a natural disaster. It is not a technological accident in any simple sense. The arrival accounts describe something that seems purposeful without being explicable, organized without being obviously commanded, destructive in some contexts, and preservational in others. The dissonance of these descriptions is itself informative. The atmospheric effects of Ark's arrival, as described in survivor accounts, and as implied by the current state of the game's environments, are significant. Something changed about the surface environment during and after Ark's arrival in ways that went beyond simple occupation or destruction. The air, the weather patterns, the electromagnetic environment all appear to have been affected. The game does not explain exactly how or why, but the effects are part of why the surface is as hostile to unprotected humans as it is. The religious and spiritual responses to Ark's arrival, as visible in the lore, are diverse and in some cases quite remarkable. Some communities interpreted Ark's arrival through existing religious frameworks, as judgment, as testing, as the fulfillment of prophecy. Others developed entirely new frameworks to make sense of something that existing belief systems had not anticipated. The spiritual and philosophical ferment of the arrival period is something the lore acknowledges as a real dimension of the human response to Ark, not just the practical and military dimensions. The art and creative output produced during and immediately after Ark's arrival is referenced in the lore in ways that I find particularly interesting. People made things during the chaos. They wrote, they drew, they made music, not because conditions were good or because it made practical sense, but because creating something is one of the ways humans respond to overwhelming experience. Some of this creative output survived to the game's present. It is some of the most immediate and direct connection to the arrival period that the lore provides. The economic collapse that accompanied Ark's arrival happened with stunning speed. The interconnected systems of production, distribution, exchange, and currency that constituted the pre-Ark economy were deeply dependent on infrastructure and stability that Ark's arrival destroyed or disrupted. Within a very short period, the economic frameworks that had organized pre-Ark society became largely irrelevant. The new economies that developed on the stations and in the raider community were built from scratch under radically different conditions. The political authority that had existed in the pre-Ark world did not survive the arrival in any intact form. Some institutions tried to maintain continuity, to preserve the legal and governmental structures of the world before. Others abandoned those structures almost immediately and improvised new ones suited to the conditions they faced. The political landscape of the game's present, with its competing station factions and raider organizations, is the product of this political reinvention under pressure, and the traces of the old institutional world are visible if you know where to look. The role of private enterprise in the arrival and evacuation period is a lore thread that the game handles with some care. The organizations that had the logistics capacity and the resources to facilitate large-scale evacuation were not governments in many cases. They were corporations, private entities, organizations that had built their capabilities for commercial purposes and found themselves in a position to deploy those capabilities in the crisis. The influence of those entities on the structure of the post-Ark world is something the lore raises as a significant factor. The first winter after Ark's arrival, if we can call it that, the first period of stability after the initial chaos, is described in the lore as a time of reckoning. People on the stations took stock of what they had lost, who was present and who was not. The psychological weight of the arrival period settled in ways that the immediate chaos had not allowed, and the communities that would define the game's present began to take their initial shape during this period of painful consolidation. The communications that made it out during Ark's arrival, the transmissions that were received on the stations during the worst of it, are among the most powerful lore fragments in the game. They are not always coherent. They do not always have endings. They are the voices of people who were still down there, trying to tell what was happening, sending words into the uncertain hope that someone was listening. Some of those transmissions were the last thing those people ever sent. The question of whether Ark's arrival could have been predicted and whether any institutions or individuals had warning that went unheeded is one that the game's lore handles with deliberate ambiguity. There are fragments that suggest something was known or suspected before the arrival happened. There are also fragments that suggest the arrival was genuinely unprecedented and unforeseeable. The law does not resolve this tension. It presents the fragments and lets you sit with the discomfort of not knowing. The documentation of Ark's initial occupation of specific sites is available in scattered form through the game's environments. The logs and records from the early occupation period are different in character from the pre-Ark world's mundane bureaucratic records. They have the quality of emergency documentation, things written quickly and under pressure, with the sense that the writer was not sure they would survive long enough to write anything more. They are specific and immediate in a way that makes them hit differently from the more processed and organized lore fragments. The relationship between Ark's initial arrival and Ark's current state on the surface is something the lore treats as a development rather than a fixed condition. Ark now is not the same as Ark during the arrival. Something has changed, grown, evolved. The occupation of the surface is more established, more organized, more layered than it was during the initial period. Whether this development represents progress towards some goal or simply the natural progression of a system doing what it does is a question the lore raises and does not answer. The survivors who made it to the stations and who had direct experience of Ark's arrival represent a living library of information about what happened. In the game's present, many of them are still alive, and their accounts, their memories, their interpretations of what they experienced are a resource that different factions value and use in different ways. The politics of survivor testimony, who gets heard, whose account is treated as authoritative, whose is dismissed or marginalized, is a thread that runs through the game's factional dynamics. The technology that humans had developed by the time of Ark's arrival was, in some ways, a double-edged element. The automation and networked systems that had made pre-Ark society efficient and productive were also systems that Ark's presence could interact with in ways that humans did not anticipate. The pre-Ark world had built sophisticated, interconnected technological infrastructure, and some of that infrastructure became part of the problem rather than part of the solution when Ark arrived. The animals of the pre-Ark world, or rather their absence from the game's current surface environments, is a dimension of the arrival's impact that the lore acknowledges without fully explaining. What happened to the native fauna of the regions that Ark occupied is not spelled out. The game's environments are not entirely devoid of biological life, but the life that is present is not the wildlife that would have been there before. Something changed, and Ark's arrival is the most obvious candidate for the cause. The scale of Ark's initial establishment on the surface, as implied by the current state of the game's world, was extraordinary. The lore suggests that Ark did not arrive and then gradually expand over years. The expansion of Ark's presence on the surface happened quickly, and by the time the people on the orbital stations had stabilized enough to take stock of the situation below, Ark's occupation was already extensive. The window for any kind of conventional intervention, if such a thing was ever possible, closed very quickly. The children born on the stations after the evacuation, the first generation to know no world other than the station and the stories of the world below, are a demographic that the lore begins to account for in the game's present. These are the people for whom the pre-Ark world is history rather than memory. Their relationship to the surface, to Ark, to the question of whether Earth can ever be reclaimed is different from that of the evacuees, and that generational difference shapes the politics and the culture of the station communities in ways that the lore makes clear. The first organized efforts to understand what Ark actually was, rather than simply to survive it, began relatively early in the station period. The scientists and researchers who had made it to the stations did not simply set down their work when they arrived. They redirected it. The study of Ark, the attempt to understand its nature and its behavior and its apparent logic, became one of the central intellectual projects of the post-arrival period. The state of that understanding in the game's present is one of the most interesting aspects of the current law. The economic value of the surface, and specifically of the resources and information that could be retrieved from Ark-occupied territories, was recognized almost as soon as the station communities stabilized enough to think about anything beyond immediate survival. The origins of the raider economy are in this recognition. The surface was not just a lost world. It was a resource that could be accessed carefully and at significant risk by people who were willing and able to make the descent. The first formal raider missions, as described in the law, were very different from the polished professional operations that raiding has become in the game's present. They were improvised, under-equipped, and often tragic. The loss rate among early raiders was extremely high. The knowledge base that would eventually develop into raider culture, the understanding of Ark's behaviours and zones and the rhythms of descent and extraction, was built at enormous cost, piece by piece, mission by mission, from the lessons of the survivors and from the absence of those who did not come back. The question of what Ark was doing during the early period of its surface occupation, what it was building or creating or processing while humanity was in chaos, is one that the law suggests is important. Ark was not idle while humans were dealing with the crisis of the arrival and the evacuation. It was active. It was doing something. The character of the surface that raiders find when they descend is the result of whatever Ark was doing in those early years. And understanding that activity is one of the keys to understanding what Ark is. The establishment of communication networks between the stations and the early raider community was a technical and political challenge that the law acknowledges. Information about what was happening on the surface needed to get back to the stations. The people who organized the early intelligence gathering operations around what raiders were observing and reporting were laying the groundwork for what would become a significant industry and a significant power base. Information about Ark, accurate and timely information, has been valuable from the very beginning of the post-arrival period. The emotional landscape of the post-arrival pre-stabilization period on the stations is something the law renders through personal accounts and fragments rather than through summary. Grief was everywhere. Loss of people, loss of places, loss of the world as it had been. And alongside the grief, the very human business of figuring out how to continue, how to feed people, how to allocate space, how to maintain systems, how to make decisions collectively in conditions that no one had designed for. The unglamorous, essential work of keeping a displaced civilization alive. The moment when the situation shifted from survival crisis to something more like a sustained condition, when people began to think not just about the next week, but about the next year, about the next generation, about what they were building and not just what they were enduring, is a transition the law marks, without being specific about when exactly it happened. It happened at different times for different communities. For some, it never fully happened. But that shift from crisis to condition is one of the most important transitions in the history of the post-Ark world, and everything in the game's present exists on the far side of it. Chapter 3, The Exodus, Humanity Flees to the Skies. The orbital stations that humanity retreated to during and after Ark's arrival were not built in a panic. The infrastructure for sustained human habitation in low orbit had been developed over many years before Ark appeared. What Ark's arrival did was transform this infrastructure from a forward-looking project, humanity expanding its presence beyond the planet, into something much more urgent and much less triumphant. The stations were supposed to be a beginning. They became a refuge. The physical structure of the orbital stations, as the game's lore presents them, reflects this dual origin. Some elements of the station design are ambitious and forward-looking, built with expansion and long-term habitation in mind. Others are jury-rigged, improvised additions from the evacuation period, built fast and built to work rather than built to last. The layered character of the station architecture tells a story of an ongoing project that got radically repurposed under pressure. The logistics of the evacuation itself were extraordinary, and the lore acknowledges this without turning it into a simple success story. Moving large numbers of people to the stations required transport capacity that had to be assembled and directed under chaotic conditions, with Ark's arrival disrupting communication and coordination at every stage. That significant numbers of people made it at all is remarkable. The fact that many did not is something the lore does not gloss over. The selection of who could go, where there was any selection involved at all, rather than simply the accident of who was in the right place at the right time, is one of the most morally charged elements of the evacuation lore. Some accounts describe explicit triage decisions made by people in positions of authority. Others describe a more chaotic process, where the outcome was determined less by any decision than by circumstance. Both were true, in different places and at different times. The moral complexity of the evacuation is something that different factions in the game's present have very different relationships with. The resources that evacuees brought with them to the stations shaped what the post-Ark station communities became. It was not just people who made the journey, it was skills, knowledge, equipment, data, cultural artifacts, organizational infrastructure. The things that could be brought determined what could be rebuilt, what could be maintained, what kind of civilization could continue under the constraints of orbital habitation. The choices about what to prioritize, when space was limited and time was short, are another dimension of the evacuation's moral complexity. The early days on the stations were not simply relief at having escaped. The psychological reality of the situation was acute and complicated. Survivors were dealing with the trauma of what they had experienced during Ark's arrival, with grief for people and places they had left behind, and with the immediate practical demands of a radically unfamiliar living situation. The stations were not designed to absorb the populations they were absorbing, and the strain on every system, physical, social, psychological, was immense. The social dynamics that emerged in the early station period were significantly shaped by who arrived with what. Groups that had organized themselves effectively for the evacuation and arrived with functioning social structures and useful resources found themselves in much stronger positions than those who arrived in fragmented, depleted, or disorganized states. The hierarchies and alliances that formed in those early days had long-lasting effects on the political structures of the station communities. The food systems of the early stations were a constant source of anxiety. The stations had not been designed to feed the populations that were now depending on them. Rapidly improvised agricultural and food production systems, hydroponics, protein synthesis, various forms of cultivation that could work in microgravity or in the constrained space of the stations were developed or expanded under enormous pressure. The people who had expertise in these systems became critically important, and that importance translated into social and political influence. The medical situation in the early station period was another source of significant strain. Evacuees arrived with injuries and illnesses from the Ark event. Overcrowding created conditions for the rapid spread of disease. Medical resources and personnel were stretched beyond their designed capacity. The experiences of the early station period forged a deep cultural awareness of the fragility of human life and health in a constrained environment, and this awareness shapes the character of the station communities in the game's present. The children who were born on the stations in the years immediately following the evacuation are a generation that the lore attends to with particular interest. These are people who came into the world in conditions of extraordinary difficulty and instability, who grew up in environments shaped by trauma and loss and constant resource pressure, and who are now the active generation in the game's present. Their psychology, their values, their relationship to the world below, and the question of reclaiming it is directly shaped by the conditions of their upbringing. The educational systems that developed on the stations were necessarily different from those of the pre-Ark world. The curriculum that needed to be transmitted was partly the accumulated knowledge of the civilization that had preceded Ark's arrival, and partly the entirely new body of knowledge about how to survive and function in the station environment. The people who managed to transmit both, who built educational frameworks capable of preserving the old while teaching the new, made an enormous contribution to the long-term viability of the station communities. The political organisation of the early stations was improvised and contested. Different groups arrived with different ideas about how decisions should be made, what the rules should be, who should have authority over what. The process of working out governance structures that could function across the diverse and traumatized populations of the early stations was slow and painful, and often produced results that satisfied no one completely. The political structures visible in the game's present are the result of this long and difficult process of negotiation and compromise and, often, conflict. The culture of the early stations was a strange blend of the imported and the invented. People brought their cultural identities and traditions with them, and these did not simply dissolve in the common experience of displacement. The pre-Ark world's cultural diversity survived the evacuation and continued on the stations, adapted and modified by the conditions of the new environment, but not erased. At the same time, entirely new cultural elements emerged from the shared experience of the station period. The cultural landscape of the game's present is a product of this mixing. The relationship between the different station communities has never been simple. From the earliest days of the post-Ark period, different stations had different resources, different populations, different approaches to governance, and different ideas about what the priority should be. Should the focus be on long-term station sustainability, on eventually reclaiming Earth, on understanding what Ark is and whether it can be negotiated with or defeated? These are not questions that have ever been answered in a way that everyone agrees on, and the disagreements about them are a major driver of the factional politics visible in the game's lore. The development of the raider profession did not happen in a vacuum. It emerged from a specific set of conditions, on the stations and in response to a specific set of needs. The stations needed resources from the surface. The surface was dangerous, but accessible to people with the right equipment and skills, and there were people on the stations who were willing for various reasons to take the risk of descent. The intersection of need, supply, and willingness is where the raider economy was born, and the lore traces this origin with enough specificity to make it feel grounded and real. The first raider organizations were informal, operating more like informal guilds or mutual support networks than the structured commercial and professional entities that some of them have become in the game's present. The development of more formal structures was driven by practical necessity, by the need to coordinate descents, manage risk, share knowledge, and allocate the resources that came back up. The organizational history of raider culture is a thread that runs through a significant portion of the game's lore. The equipment that early raiders used was improvised and often inadequate. The specialized gear that characterizes raiding in the game's present was developed over time, refined through experience and necessity, often at significant cost in human life. The raider equipment visible in the game represents the accumulated technological adaptation of many generations of people trying to survive on a surface that Ark has made profoundly hostile to unprotected humans. Every piece of that equipment has a history. The knowledge base about Ark's surface behavior that raiders have developed is one of the most valuable bodies of knowledge in the game's world. Understanding how Ark's entities move and respond, which zones are more and less dangerous, what times and conditions affect Ark activity, how to extract resources efficiently without triggering escalated response, All of this knowledge was built through experience, through the observations of countless raiders who went down and came back, and through the painful lessons left by those who did not. The cultural identity of raiders as a distinct community within the broader station world is something the lore develops with genuine care. Raiders are not simply a job category. They have a shared culture, a shared set of values and practices, a shared relationship to risk and to the surface below. The game's lore presents this identity as something that emerged organically from the specific conditions and demands of the raider life, rather than being imposed from above or borrowed from some prior tradition. The role of information in the raider economy is fundamental. The resources that raiders bring back from the surface have obvious material value, but the information they bring back about ARC's activities, about the state of specific sites, about what can be found, where and what routes are currently viable, is also enormously valuable. The trade in raider intelligence is a significant aspect of the post-ARC economy, and it shapes relationships between raiders and the various station factions in complex ways. The relationship between the station communities and the raider population has never been entirely comfortable. Raiders are necessary because the resources they bring back are essential to station survival and development. But they are also a community with their own culture and values that does not always align with the priorities of station governance. The tension between dependency and unease characterizes much of the official relationship between station institutions and the raider community, and the lore gives this tension real texture. The specific character of Cayman Station, the main station hub that features prominently in the game's world, is something the lore develops in detail. Cayman is not simply a neutral platform. It has a history, a political character, a set of dominant factions, and ongoing conflicts. The choices that Cayman's leadership has made about how to relate to the raider community, what resources to allocate to understanding ARC, what kind of governance to practice, all of these choices have shaped Cayman into the specific place it is in the game's present. The other stations, the communities and platforms beyond Cayman appear in the lore in ways that fill out the picture of the post-ARC human world. They have their own characters, their own histories, their own approaches to the central challenges of the post-ARC situation. The relationships between Cayman and these other communities are not always warm. Competition for resources, ideological disagreements, historical grievances, all of these factors complicate the picture of humanity in orbit. The trade networks that have developed between the stations represent one of the more optimistic elements of the post-ARC lore. Despite everything, despite the conflicts and the scarcity and the political tensions, humanity has managed to develop systems of exchange that allow different communities to specialize and to share the products of that specialization. These trade networks are fragile and contested, but they exist, and their existence is itself evidence of something durable in human social organization. The communications technology that connects the various station communities and supports communication with raiders on the surface is a field that has seen enormous development in the post-ARC period. The game's lore suggests that significant resources and talent have been directed at maintaining and improving communication capability, both because of its practical importance and because of its symbolic importance as a marker of the continued connectedness of the human communities. The biological challenges of long-term life in the station environment are something the lore acknowledges. Human bodies are not designed for permanent life in microgravity or the modified gravity environments of the stations. The health effects of station life are a real factor in the lives of the station populations, and the medical and biological sciences have been significantly shaped by the need to address these effects. The children born in the station environment and the people who have spent decades there are in various ways becoming different from what humans were in the pre-ARC world. The psychological impact of long-term displacement, of knowing that the planet you belong to by origin and heritage is occupied by something hostile, is a thread the lore weaves through much of its characterization of station life. The grief of displacement does not simply resolve over time. It changes character. It becomes background rather than foreground. But it remains, and it shapes how people relate to the question of Ark and to the question of what, if anything, humanity can do to change the situation. The generational transmission of memory is one of the most important cultural processes in the station world, and the lore attends to it with care. How do you tell a child about a world they have never seen? How do you convey the texture of a life on Earth to someone who has only ever known the constrained, controlled environment of a station? The strategies that different communities use for this transmission, the stories they tell, the artifacts they preserve, the practices they maintain, are part of what defines each community's identity. The question of whether the orbital stations are a temporary refuge or a permanent home is one that different communities and individuals in the game's world answer very differently. For some, the stations are a waypoint, a place to survive until Earth can be reclaimed. For others, the stations have become home in a full sense, and the question of reclaiming Earth is abstract and theoretical rather than a real personal priority. This division of attitude is one of the major fault lines in post-Ark human culture. The artists and storytellers of the station world occupy an important cultural role, and the lore acknowledges this. In conditions of scarcity and confinement, the people who create beauty and meaning and narrative are not a luxury, they are a necessity. The cultural production of the station communities tells the story of what it means to be human in an extraordinary circumstance, and some of that cultural production makes its way into the game's environments in ways that are quietly moving. The scientists of the station world are a community with enormous influence and significant internal division. They share a commitment to understanding Ark and to developing the capabilities that might eventually change the human situation. But they disagree, sometimes sharply, about methods, priorities, and what the evidence actually means. The scientific discourse of the station world is not a smooth consensus. It is a field of ongoing argument and uncertainty, which is, honestly, what good science looks like. The religious and spiritual communities of the station world have adapted in diverse ways to the conditions of post-Ark life. Some have maintained pre-Ark traditions with relatively little modification. Others have developed new theological and philosophical frameworks suited to the extraordinary circumstances. The question of Ark's nature and purpose has been addressed by religious and spiritual thinkers in ways that range from the deeply thoughtful to the frankly bizarre. The lore presents this diversity without endorsing any particular interpretation. The economic systems of the station world in the game's present are complex and layered. The raider economy intersects with the internal economies of the various stations, with trade networks between communities, with the specialized economies of scientific research and development, with the political economies of the major factions. Understanding who has economic power in this world and why is essential to understanding the political and social dynamics that the game's lore explores. The governing institutions of the station world range from relatively democratic structures to more authoritarian arrangements, with everything in between. The game's lore does not present a single model of good governance as the correct approach. It presents a diversity of approaches, each with their own logic and their own costs, and lets the player navigate this complexity without being told what to think about it. The role of the major factions in shaping life on the stations is one of the most developed threads in the game's lore. These factions are not simply political parties or corporate interests, though they have elements of both. They are communities of shared belief and interest that cut across the station world and shape almost every aspect of life for the people within their orbit. Understanding the major factions is essential to understanding the political and social landscape of the game's world. The question of Ark's intelligence, the question that this entire video is ultimately building toward, is not separate from the social and political life of the station world. It is deeply embedded in it. Different factions have different views on what Ark is and what it means. Those views shape policy, shape resource allocation, shape the character of raider missions, shape relationships between the stations. The intelligence question is not just a scientific puzzle. It is a political and cultural fault line that runs through the entire post-Ark human world. The daily life of a station resident, as painted by the law, is defined by both constraint and adaptation. The physical environment of a station is limited and controlled in ways that Earth life never was. Privacy is at a premium. Natural light and open space are luxuries rather than givens. The rhythms of life are set by systems and schedules rather than by weather and seasons. But within these constraints, people have built lives that are recognizable as fully human. They have relationships, ambitions, conflicts, moments of joy and beauty and connection. The station world is a diminished world in some ways, and a fully human one in others. The aspirations of the station communities, what they're working toward, what they hope for, what they think the future could hold, are as diverse as the communities themselves. Some groups are oriented toward the past, toward restoring what was lost. Others are oriented toward the future they are building in the station environment, setting aside the question of Earth as one that may not be answerable in their lifetimes. Others still are oriented toward the mystery of Ark itself, toward the possibility that understanding it is the key that unlocks every other question. This diversity of aspiration is one of the things that makes the game's world feel alive and complex. The violence and conflict within and between station communities is a reality that the law does not sanitize. The pressures of post-Ark life are real and significant, and they generate real conflict. Not all of that conflict is between humans and Ark. A significant amount of it is between humans and other humans, over resources, over power, over the direction of the community, over old grievances and new ones. The game's world is not a story of humanity united against a common enemy. It is a story of humanity dealing with an extraordinary challenge while remaining fully, messily human. The possibility of contact with groups or individuals on the surface of Earth who did not evacuate, who have been living in or around Ark's occupation for the years since the arrival, is something the lore raises in interesting ways. Not every human who was present when Ark arrived made it to the stations. Some survived, somehow, in the occupied territories. The nature of that survival, what it looks like, what price it has extracted is one of the more shadowed corners of the game's lore. The infrastructure that sustains the stations, the mechanical and engineering systems that keep the populations of the orbital communities alive, is a constant preoccupation of the station world. The people who maintain these systems, the engineers and technicians whose work is the literal foundation of the community's survival, are a class that the lore treats with a quiet respect. Their work is not glamorous. It is not the work that gets celebrated in the stories that communities tell about themselves, but it is the work without which none of the rest of it is possible. The end of this chapter and the beginning of the next part of the story is a question rather than an answer. Humanity evacuated, humanity rebuilt, humanity adapted, and all the while down below, Ark has been doing something on the surface of the planet, building something or processing something or working towards something. The question that the Raiders are uniquely positioned to help answer, the question that drives so much of the game's action and lore is, what exactly is that something? Chapter 4. Cayman and the Stations, Life Above the Clouds. Cayman Station is the beating heart of the game's world, the place where raiders return after their descents, where resources flow in and information flows out, where the political dramas of the post-Ark human community play out against the backdrop of a planet occupied by machine entities that no one fully understands. Understanding Cayman means understanding the world the game takes place in, and the lore that fleshes out Cayman's character is some of the richest and most carefully developed in the game. The physical structure of Cayman, as implied by the game's environment and by various lore fragments, is a product of its history. It was not built as a single unified construction. It grew, added to over years, modified and expanded as circumstances demanded, incorporating elements that were not originally designed to work together. The result is a place that is functional but not elegant, pragmatic but not beautiful, deeply marked by the history of its own development. The population of Cayman is diverse in a very specific sense. It is not diverse in the way a pre-Ark city might have been diverse, by the accident of geography and migration and the organic mixing of populations over time. It is diverse in the way of a refugee community, where people from many different backgrounds have been brought together by a common catastrophe rather than by choice. This changes the character of the diversity in ways that are both enriching and difficult. The governance of Cayman is one of the most contested elements of the game's political lore. Who actually runs Cayman, in what sense, with what legitimacy, is not a simple question. The formal institutions that claim authority over various aspects of station life coexist with the informal power of factions, of economic interests, of the raider community's self-governance. The gaps between formal and actual power on Cayman are significant, and navigating them is part of what life on the station requires. The major factions that operate on Cayman have shaped its character in profound ways. Each faction has its own culture, its own values, its own approach to the central questions of the post-Ark world. Their competition for influence on Cayman is not simply a power struggle. It is a genuine contest of ideas about what the right priorities are, what the right relationship with Ark should be, what the right vision of humanity's future is. The lore does not declare any one of them correct. It presents the contest and lets it be complex. The economic life of Cayman revolves significantly around the raider economy. Raiders go down, raiders come back. What they bring back gets processed and distributed and traded. This cycle is the engine of Cayman's material existence, but the lore suggests that this engine creates its own distortions. The things that raiders can bring back shape what Cayman's economy can produce and consume. The priorities of the surface, what can be accessed and extracted, shape the priorities of the station in ways that are not always recognized or acknowledged. The social hierarchy of Cayman is real, even if it is not formally acknowledged. Access to better quarters, to more food, to higher quality equipment, to influence over decisions, these things are not evenly distributed. The patterns of who has more and who has less on Cayman reflect, not perfectly, but clearly enough, the patterns of who had more and less in the pre-Ark world. The evacuation did not reset the social hierarchy, it relocated it. The cultural life of Cayman is vibrant in the way that constrained communities often develop surprisingly rich cultural lives. When physical space is limited and material comfort is not guaranteed, the cultural and creative life of a community becomes even more important as a site of meaning-making and connection. Cayman has its music, its stories, its rituals, its festivals. These things exist alongside and in tension with the constant practical pressures of station life, but they exist and they matter. The relationship between Cayman and the raiders is one of mutual dependency and mutual unease. Cayman needs what the raiders bring back. The raiders need Cayman as a base of operations, a market, a place to rest and repair and re-equip, but the cultures are not the same, and the frictions are real. The raider community's experience of the surface gives them a perspective on Ark and on the human situation that station residents who have never descended do not have, and that experiential gap creates distance and sometimes contempt in both directions. The research and scientific community on Cayman is well developed and well-resourced by the standards of the station world. Understanding ARC has been a priority from early on, and significant talent and resources have been directed at that understanding. The state of that research in the game's present is characterized by genuine progress in some areas and by persistent, baffling mystery in others. The scientists on Cayman know more about ARC than anyone in the post-ARC world. They also know how much they do not know, and that knowledge is humbling. The medical facilities on Cayman are one of the most important elements of its infrastructure, both practically and symbolically. Raiders return from the surface injured, exposed, sometimes in severe condition. The capability to treat those injuries and conditions is essential to the viability of the raider profession. The medical community on Cayman has developed expertise in ARC exposure effects, in the specific injuries and conditions that result from encounters with ARC's entities, that has no parallel anywhere else in the human world. The communication and information systems of Cayman are sophisticated and heavily used. The station is a hub not just for physical resources, but for information, for the intelligence that raiders bring back about the surface, for the scientific data that researchers produce about ARC. The management of this information, who has access to what, who can control the flow of intelligence, is a significant dimension of Cayman's political life. Information is power, and the control of information systems is one of the key sites of factional competition on the station. The psychological support systems on Cayman, the ways that the community addresses the mental and emotional health of its population, are a feature of the station that the law touches on with some care. The stresses of station life, including the particular stresses of a community that relies on people regularly risking their lives on the surface, are real and ongoing. The approaches that Cayman has developed to address these stresses range from the formal and institutionalized to the informal and community-based. The engineering and maintenance infrastructure of Cayman is the station's unglamorous backbone. The people who keep the life support systems running, who maintain the hull integrity, who ensure that the recycling and water recovery systems operate correctly, are doing work that is literally life or death for the station's population. The culture of this engineering community is distinct, defined by pragmatism and problem-solving and a particular kind of quiet pride in keeping everything working. The food systems on Cayman have developed significantly from the improvised arrangements of the early station period. Cayman has a working agricultural sector, producing a variety of food through hydroponic and aeroponic systems, supplemented by protein synthesis and various forms of processed nutrition. The food supply is not generous by pre-ARC standards, but it is adequate, and the systems that produce it are some of the most technically sophisticated on the station. The political institutions of Cayman, the councils and authorities and governance structures that exist formally, are one dimension of the station's political life, but the law makes clear that formal institutions do not capture the whole story. The informal power networks, the factional alliances, the economic interests that shape decisions behind the scenes are at least as important in determining what actually happens on Cayman. The gap between the formal and the informal is a constant theme in Cayman's political law. The relationship between Cayman and the other stations in the human orbital community is defined by a mixture of cooperation and competition. Cayman is the largest and most significant hub, but it is not the only one, and the other stations have their own priorities and their own approaches. The trade and communication networks that connect the stations are essential to all of them, but they are also sites of negotiation and tension. Cayman's prominence makes it a target for resentment as much as a source of resources. The history of Cayman since the evacuation is a history of development, crisis, adaptation, and development again. The station has been through periods of severe resource stress, of political crisis, of conflict between factions. It has also been through periods of relative stability and progress. The version of Cayman that appears in the game's present is a product of all of this history, marked by it in ways that are visible if you know what to look at. The particular culture of Cayman's Raider Quarter, the section of the station where the Raider community concentrates, is one of the most developed elements of the game's atmospheric lore. This is a community defined by its relationship to the surface, by the shared experience of descent and extraction, by the particular combination of professionalism and fatalism that characterizes people who regularly risk their lives for material and informational gain. The Raider Quarter has its own economy, its own social hierarchies, its own traditions and rituals. The children of Cayman grow up in a world where the surface below is simultaneously a constant presence and a place they have never been. They hear about it constantly, from the raiders who return from it, from the researchers who study it, from the political debates about what to do about it. The surface is the most important place in their world, and most of them will never set foot on it. This is a strange situation for a generation to grow up in, and it shapes them in ways that the lore begins to explore. The arts and cultural production of Cayman tell the story of a community trying to make meaning out of an extraordinary situation. The music that has developed on Cayman has its own character, distinct from pre-Ark traditions while clearly connected to them. The visual arts, the storytelling traditions, the performative and celebratory elements of Cayman's culture, all of these things reflect the specific experience of a community that lives in orbit above an occupied planet, dependent on the willingness of brave and desperate people to descend to that planet and come back alive. The scientific understanding of Ark that has been developed on Cayman is one of the most significant intellectual achievements of the post-Ark world. It is also deeply frustrating in its incompleteness. Ark is not a simple system. It does not behave according to rules that can be easily formalized or predicted. The researchers who study it have made genuine progress in understanding certain aspects of its behavior, but the deeper questions, what Ark is fundamentally, what it is doing on the surface, whether there is any form of intelligence directing it, remain stubbornly open. The relationship between the scientific community and the political and factional power structures on Cayman is complicated. The scientists need resources and authority to do their work. The factions want to control and direct scientific research in ways that serve their interests. The result is a set of ongoing negotiations and tensions that shape what gets studied, how it gets studied, and how the results are used. Science on Cayman is not independent of politics. It never was. The spiritual and religious life of Cayman reflects the diversity of the populations that came together to form the station community. Multiple traditions coexist, sometimes in genuine dialogue and sometimes in tension. The question of Ark's nature has theological dimensions for many of Cayman's religious communities, and the theological debates about what Ark is and what it means are part of the broader cultural and intellectual ferment of the station. The development of radar technology, the specialized equipment that makes surface descents possible and survivable, is a field that Cayman has invested in significantly. The radar equipment visible in the game represents the state of the art in this field, the product of years of development guided by the hard experience of what works and what does not on the surface. The people who design and build this equipment are a significant part of Cayman's technological community, and their work is directly connected to the viability of the radar profession, and through it to the viability of the station economy. The water and air recycling systems of Cayman are among its most critical infrastructure, and the law acknowledges this through the frequency with which they appear in discussions of the station's practical challenges. These are systems that cannot fail without catastrophic consequences, and the engineering effort devoted to maintaining and improving them is enormous. The people who work on these systems are among the most essential members of the station community, even if they do not always receive the recognition that entails. The political debates on Cayman about the right relationship with ARC are ongoing and genuinely contested. Should the priority be understanding ARC, evading it, fighting it, communicating with it, if that is even possible? Different factions advocate for different approaches, and the resources that Cayman devotes to each of these strategies reflect the current balance of factional power. The debates are not settled. They continue, and the outcome of each round of the debate shapes what Cayman does next. The history of Ark Raiders itself, as a game and as a piece of creative work, is not something I can address within the law framework here and I'm working with here, but I want to note that the world the developers have built has the quality of a world that has been thought about deeply and from multiple directions. The law of Cayman does not feel like decoration. It feels like the foundation of something that the creators have genuinely invested in. The night cycle on Cayman, the darkening and dimming of lights that marks the station's artificial day, is a small detail that the law gestures toward in ways that are evocative. The station's rhythms are artificial, imposed by systems and schedules rather than by the natural world, but they are rhythms, and people's lives organize themselves around them. The station has a quality of dailiness, of routine and habit, and the marking of time that makes it feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. The recreation and leisure facilities of Cayman are limited by the station's physical constraints, but are taken seriously as a component of the community's quality of life. Physical space for exercise, social spaces for gathering, facilities for creative and cultural activities. These things are not luxuries in a community under the kind of sustained stress that Cayman experiences. They are necessities, and the resources devoted to them reflect an understanding of that. The age structure of Cayman's population has shifted significantly since the early station period. The evacuees of the Ark arrival are older now. The generation born on the stations is the active adult generation. The children growing up now are the grandchildren of the evacuation. This demographic shift changes the character of the community in ways that are still unfolding, and the law is aware of this ongoing change. The specific role of the raider profession in Cayman's self-image is worth noting. Raiders are not simply workers doing a job. They are, in the cultural imagination of Cayman, something between heroes and daredevils, people who are willing to go to the place that everyone else is afraid of, who bring back the things that everyone else needs. This cultural image is flattering and limiting at the same time. It creates a particular kind of celebrity around successful raiders and a particular kind of silence around the ones who do not come back. The archives and libraries of Cayman hold the accumulated knowledge and history of the post-Ark period, including as much of the pre-Ark world's cultural and intellectual heritage as could be preserved. These repositories are among the most valued resources on the station, and access to them is carefully managed. The archivists and librarians who maintain them occupy a culturally significant role, even if they do not always have political power commensurate with that significance. The future of Cayman, as imagined by the people who live there, is a topic of ongoing debate and disagreement. The visions range from an indefinite continuation of the current situation, with the station community sustaining itself in orbit while Ark occupies the surface below, to an eventual reclaiming of Earth through whatever means proves necessary. The diversity of these visions reflects the diversity of the community itself, and the political conflicts around them are some of the most significant ongoing dramas in Cayman's life. The quiet moments in Cayman's lore, the fragments that show individual lives lived against the backdrop of the station's grand dramas, are some of my favourite elements of the game's world building. A raider preparing their equipment the night before a descent, a researcher working late in an underlit laboratory, frustrated by results that will not resolve into a pattern, A family eating a meal in a small station apartment, talking about something ordinary. These moments are the texture of the world, and without them, the grand law would be hollow. Chapter 5. The Raiders, Who Goes Back Down, and Why the Raiders of Ark Raiders are not a monolithic community. They are a diverse group of people, united by their willingness and ability to descend to Ark's occupied surface, to navigate its dangers, and to bring back what they find. The reasons people become raiders are as diverse as the raiders themselves, and the lore takes care to develop this diversity rather than reducing it to a single character type. The financial motivations for raiding are real and significant. The resources that can be retrieved from the surface have genuine value in the station economy, and the raider profession can provide financial stability and even prosperity for those who are good at it and lucky enough to survive long enough to develop their skills. For many raiders, the financial dimension is primary. They're doing a dangerous job because it pays and the pay matters. The desire to understand Ark is another significant motivation that the lore identifies among the raider community. Some raiders descend not primarily for resources, but for information, for the chance to observe Ark directly, to collect data that the research community cannot get from the station. These information-focused raiders have a different relationship to the surface than those primarily motivated by material extraction, and their perspective on what Ark is and what it is doing is shaped by their particular mode of engagement with it. The personal losses that many raiders are responding to, the connection to places and people, and a world that Ark took, are a powerful motivator that the lore treats with respect. For some raiders, every descent is in some sense a return to what was taken from them or from people they care about. This is not always a healthy motivation, and the lore does not pretend it is, but it is real, and it drives real behavior, and the game's world would be less true without it. The pure adrenaline and risk-seeking dimension of raider culture is also present in the lore, handled with a kind of wry acknowledgement rather than either celebration or condemnation. There are people who raid because they are drawn to the risk, because the intensity of surface operations provides something that station life cannot. The raider culture accommodates this motivation while also developing informal norms and practices that tend to keep the most reckless impulses in check, at least among more experienced operators. The training and preparation that goes into becoming an effective raider is extensive, and the lore develops this dimension of raider culture in detail. Knowledge of Ark's surface behaviors, proficiency with the specialized equipment, physical conditioning, situational awareness, the ability to make rapid decisions under pressure, all of these are skills that need to be developed through practice and mentorship. The apprenticeship structures that the raider community has developed for transmitting these skills are one of the more interesting organizational features of raider culture. The equipment loadout decisions that raiders make before each descent are consequential and reflect a nuanced understanding of the specific challenges of the target site and objective. The lore reveals a culture of careful preparation and deliberate choice, where the difference between the right and wrong piece of equipment can be the difference between a successful extraction and a failed one, or between coming home and not. The reverence that raiders have for good equipment is not mere materialism. It is grounded in real experience of what equipment can mean. The relationships between raiders, the partnerships and teams that develop over multiple operations are some of the most humanly resonant elements of the lore. The bond that forms between people who have faced the surface together, who have depended on each other in conditions of real danger, is distinctive and intense. Raider partnerships have a specific character that reflects the specific conditions in which they form, and the lore explores this character through the histories of various raider teams and the relationships within them. The losses that the raider community absorbs regularly and inevitably shape its culture in profound ways. Raiders die. Not every raid ends in success. The community has developed rituals and practices for acknowledging these losses, for honouring the people who do not come back, for supporting those who lose partners and teammates. The culture of loss in the raider community is not morbid or defeatist. It is honest. It is a community that has learned to live with the reality of regular loss without being destroyed by it. The ethics of raiding, the norms and values that govern behaviour on the surface, are a developed dimension of raider culture that the law treats seriously. What are the limits of acceptable behaviour toward other raiders? What obligations does a raider have when they encounter a raider from a rival organisation in distress? What are the rules around information sharing, around the territorial claims of different teams, around the treatment of resources that multiple parties might claim? These are not abstract questions. They are practical problems that raider culture has developed real answers to. The diversity of raider specializations is something the law develops through the specific capabilities and expertise that different characters and organizations bring to the surface. There are extraction specialists whose expertise is in rapidly and efficiently retrieving material resources. There are infiltration specialists who move through ARC-occupied territory with minimal engagement. There are combat specialists who can hold against ARC's entities when engagement becomes unavoidable. There are technical specialists whose value is in their ability to interact with and retrieve information from ARC's technological systems. Each specialization has its own culture and its own status within the broader raider community. The physical demands of raiding are a constant factor in the law's characterization of the raider life. The equipment is heavy, the environment is hostile, the physical stress of a surface operation is significant, even before accounting for the risk of injury from ARC's entities or the environment. The physical culture of the raider community, the emphasis on conditioning, on body maintenance, on managing the cumulative physical cost of regular descents, is part of what defines raider life. The psychological demands of raiding are equally significant, and the law attends to these with care. The psychological impact of regularly facing a dangerous and imperfectly understood environment, of making life and death decisions under pressure, of losing partners and teammates, of confronting the reality of ARC's occupation up close and personally, all of these take a toll. The coping mechanisms that raiders develop, healthy and otherwise, are part of the texture of raider culture. The question of what raiders actually see on the surface in terms of ARC's activities and the state of the occupied environment is one of the most important sources of information in the game's lore. Raiders are the primary direct observers of ARC's surface behavior. What they report, what they describe, what they bring back as evidence is the foundation of much of what the research community on Cayman knows about ARC. The raider as witness, as the person who has been there and can describe what they saw, is a significant cultural and epistemic role. The commercial and financial structures that organize the raider economy are more complex than they might appear at first glance. The markets for surface-retrieved resources, the companies and organizations that buy and process what raiders bring back, the financial instruments and contracts that structure raider employment and compensation, all of this constitutes a genuine economic subsystem within the broader station economy. The people who run and profit from this subsystem are not always raiders themselves, and the relationship between raiders and the commercial interests that benefit from their work is a source of ongoing tension and negotiation. The veteran raiders, the people who have been doing this for years or decades and have accumulated deep experience and expertise, occupy a particular position in raider culture. They are respected, sometimes revered. Their knowledge of ARC's surface behaviours, accumulated over many operations, is genuinely valuable, and they carry the particular weight of having seen a great deal of what the surface can do, of having lost many people they knew, of knowing more thoroughly than anyone what the real costs of raiding are. The rookie raiders, the people newly entering the profession, face a steep learning curve in a context where the cost of errors is very high. The way that raider culture manages this, the mentorship structures and the graduated exposure to increasing levels of risk, reflects a community that has learned, through painful experience, that throwing new people into full operations without preparation is a way to get a lot of new people killed. The care that experienced raiders extend to new entrants is not simply altruism. It is an understanding that the community's survival depends on training the next generation effectively. The political identity of the raider community within the broader station world is not monolithic. Different raider organizations have different political alignments and different relationships to the major factions. Some raider groups operate in close alignment with specific factions, effectively serving as the logistical arm of those factions' interests on the surface. Others maintain a studied independence, selling their services and their intelligence to multiple parties. The political economy of raider independence and alignment is one of the ongoing dynamics in the game's lore. The cultural mythology of the raider community, the stories it tells about its own origins and its most legendary figures, is something the lore develops in interesting ways. Every community has its founding myths and its heroes, and the raider community is no exception. The stories of the first raiders, the ones who went down in the chaotic early period before any of the current knowledge base existed, have taken on a heroic or tragic quality in raider cultural memory. These figures are the ancestors of the current raider community, and their legacy is both inspiring and sobering. The question of what raiders have learned about Ark from their direct observation of the surface is one of the most significant contributions the raider community makes to the broader effort to understand what is happening on Earth. Raiders have seen things that no researcher on the station has access to. They have observed Ark's entities in action, have seen Ark's construction and processing activities firsthand, have encountered structures and formations that point towards something being done with purpose and scale. Assembling these observations into a coherent picture of what Ark is doing is a central challenge for the research community, and the quality of raider reporting is a critical input into that process. The ethics of what raiders do with what they find is not a simple question. When a raider retrieves a resource from an Ark-occupied site, that resource is going into a human economy, being used to support human communities. The calculation seems simple, but the law raises complications. What about information? What about artifacts from the pre-Ark world that have cultural or historical significance beyond their material value? What obligations, if any, do raiders have to the communities that created the things they are retrieving? These are questions that raider culture has answered differently, in different contexts and different periods. The relationship between raiders and Ark's entities on the surface is not simply one of evasion and combat. The lore suggests a more complex set of interactions. Raiders have learned the behavioral patterns of Ark's entities to a degree that allows for a kind of navigation around them, an avoidance and management of encounters, rather than constant combat. The most skilled raiders are not necessarily the most effective combatants. They are the people who understand Ark's entity behaviors well enough to move through the occupied environment with minimum conflict. The things that raiders bring back from the surface, the material resources, the data, the artifacts, the intelligence about Ark's activities, all feed into the post-Ark human world in ways that are both material and interpretive. The material resources sustain the station economy. The data and intelligence sustain the research effort. The artifacts sustain the cultural connection to the pre-Ark world. And the stories that raiders tell about what they experienced on the surface sustain a community's sense of itself, its relationship to the planet it came from, and its understanding of what it is up against. The injuries that raiders sustain from encounters with Ark are a significant dimension of the law's characterization of the raider life. Ark's entities are capable of causing harm to human beings, and the specifics of that harm, the types of injuries that result from different types of entity encounters, the particular effects of Ark's energy signatures on human physiology, are things that the medical community on Cayman has studied in detail. The injury patterns of veteran raiders tell a story of repeated exposure and accumulated damage that is both technically interesting and humanly sobering. The rare raider who survives long enough to retire, to step back from regular surface operations and into a different relationship with the surface and the community, is a figure the law treats with a specific kind of reverence. Retirement is not common in the raider community. Many who do not retire are those who stay in too long, who take one risk too many after their instincts have started to slow. The ones who manage to step back at the right time, with their experience intact and their bodies not too damaged, are valuable to the community in a different way than they were as active operators. The culture of remembrance in the raider community, the ways that it marks and honors those who die on the surface, is one of the most distinctive elements of raider life. There are rituals, some formal and some informal, for marking the loss of a raider. There are traditions around how the possessions and debts of fallen raiders are handled. There are ways of speaking about the dead that reflect the specific relationship the raider community has to loss and mortality. This culture of remembrance is not morbid. It is the community's way of insisting that the people who did not come back were real, were known, were valued. The diversity of the raider community, in terms of background, age, and motivation, is one of its defining features, and the law reflects this diversity in the characters and organizations it develops. The raider profession is not defined by a single type of person. It encompasses people with very different histories, very different reasons for doing what they do, and very different approaches to the work. What they share is the willingness and the ability to go down, and a culture built around that shared willingness and ability. The children of raiders, the young people who grow up in the raider quarter of Cayman, with parents or relatives who descend regularly to the surface, have a particular relationship to the raider life. They grow up understanding it from the inside, aware of its costs and its culture in ways that outsiders are not. Some of them go on to become raiders themselves. Others carry the experience of that upbringing into entirely different trajectories. The second generation of the raider community, the children of the first and second wave of professional raiders, is now the active generation, and their relationship to the raider life has its own character. Chapter 6. The Machines, What Ark Has Built on Earth. The entities that Ark has populated the surface with are not simply machines in the sense of tools or weapons. The law suggests they are something more integrated than that, components of a larger system that is engaged in activity on the surface, that we can observe but have not fully understood. The entities move with purpose. They respond to the environment. They have behavioral patterns that are consistent enough to be learned, but complex enough to remain unpredictable. They are, in a word, interesting, and what makes them interesting is precisely the question of what they are for. The taxonomy of Ark entities that the raider community has developed over years of surface observation is one of the practical achievements of the post-Ark period. Different types of entities have been identified, named, and characterized in terms of their behavioral patterns, their capabilities, their apparent roles in Ark's surface activities. This taxonomy is not perfect and it is not complete. New entity types continue to be encountered, and the classification of some entities remains uncertain. But it represents a genuine body of knowledge, hard-won and practically valuable. The smaller Ark entities, the ones that patrol and scout and respond to disturbances, are the ones that raiders encounter most frequently. The law suggests these entities function something like a distributed sensing and response system, monitoring the surface environment and flagging anomalies for attention. Their behavior is consistent with something like an autonomous security function, though the law does not commit to that interpretation. Raiders who have survived many encounters with these smaller entities have developed nuanced understandings of their behavioral triggers and response patterns. The larger arc entities are encountered less frequently, but represent significantly greater danger when they are encountered. These are not simply bigger versions of the smaller ones. They appear to have different functions, different behavioral profiles, different levels of what might be called autonomy in their decision-making. The law suggests that the larger entities are involved in activities that go beyond patrolling and response, activities that look more like construction or processing or direction of other entities. The way that ARC's entities respond to human presence on the surface is one of the most studied and most discussed aspects of ARC's behavior in the law. The response is not uniform. In some contexts and some areas, small-scale human presence generates limited response. In others, any presence at all triggers immediate and intense engagement. The patterns of when ARC responds heavily and when it does not are partly predictable based on the knowledge the raider community has accumulated, and partly still mysterious. Understanding those patterns more fully is one of the ongoing projects of the research and raider communities. The apparent hierarchy among ARC's entities, if there is one, is something the law raises as a significant question. The different types of entities seem to have different levels of complexity in their behavior and different apparent roles in ARC's surface activities. Whether there is a command structure, whether some entities direct others, whether the hierarchy goes all the way up to something we might recognize as a central intelligence, is one of the central questions of the entire law. And the behavior of ARC's entities on the surface is one of the primary sources of evidence for thinking through that question. The material composition of ARC's entities is something that the research community on Cayman has studied extensively, using both materials retrieved from the surface and analysis of the entities that have been disabled in surface encounters. The findings are interesting and in some ways puzzling. The materials are not entirely alien. Much of what ARC's entities are made of consists of materials that were present on Earth's surface before ARC's arrival, processed and reconfigured in ways that reflect sophisticated manufacturing capability. ARC is, in a significant sense, building its entities from Earth's own material. The energy systems that power ARC's entities are one of the less well-understood aspects of their design, but they're clearly sophisticated and efficient. The entities operate across a wide range of conditions and for extended periods without the kind of maintenance and refueling that human-built machines of similar complexity would require. The energy signatures that ARC's entities emit are one of the environmental hazards that makes the surface dangerous for unprotected humans, and they are also one of the diagnostic tools that experienced raiders use to assess the presence and proximity of entities. The construction activities that ARC's entities engage in on the surface are among the most striking and mysterious elements of what ARC has been doing since its arrival. The law points toward ongoing large-scale construction activity in various parts of the surface, activity that is clearly purposeful, but whose purpose is not obvious. Structures are being built that do not have an obvious function from a human perspective. Processes are being run that consume significant resources and energy without producing outputs that fit any framework humans have for understanding what ARC might want. The processing activities that ARC runs on the surface, the ways that it handles the material resources of the planet, are something that raiders observe but cannot fully interpret. ARC is doing something with the materials of Earth's surface. It is sorting, transforming, transporting. The scale of this processing is significant, larger than any single operation, adding up to something that looks, from the evidence the raider community has accumulated, like a sustained and purposeful campaign to do something with Earth's material substrate. What exactly is being done with it is one of the central mysteries. The relationship between Ark's surface entities and the abandoned infrastructure of the pre-Ark world is one of the more telling aspects of Ark's behaviour. Ark has not simply left the old infrastructure in place. It has interacted with it, modified it, incorporated some of it into its own operations, and apparently repurposed elements of it for functions they were not originally designed to serve. The pattern of which infrastructure gets incorporated and which gets left alone or dismantled is a source of information about what Ark's priorities are. The territorial behaviour of Ark's entities, the way that certain areas seem to be more heavily guarded and certain areas less so, is something the raider community has mapped and studied. The patterns of Ark's territorial emphasis tell a story about what Ark considers important. The areas with the heaviest entity presence tend to be areas where significant construction or processing activity is happening, or areas that sit at key nodes in whatever network Ark is building on the surface. Understanding these territorial patterns is one of the most practically valuable things the raider community knows. The response escalation behaviour of Ark's entities, the way that a disturbance of a certain scale triggers a more intense response than a smaller disturbance, and the way that an escalated response can draw in entities from a wider area is one of the most important behavioural patterns for raiders to understand. Getting extraction operations right often means staying below the escalation threshold, maintaining a disturbance level that does not trigger the more intense response that would make extraction impossible. The understanding of this threshold and how to stay below it is a core competency of the experienced raider. The apparent communication among Ark's entities is something the law treats as one of the more intriguing, open questions. The entities clearly coordinate. They respond to each other's presence and actions in ways that suggest shared information. Whether this coordination happens through a direct communication channel, through Ark's broader network, through environmental signals that entities can read, or through some other mechanism, is not definitively established in the law. But the coordination is real, and it is sophisticated enough to be one of the things that makes Ark's surface a genuine challenge to navigate. The entities that raiders have observed apparently transporting materials across the surface are a particularly interesting category in terms of what they suggest about Ark's operations. These transportation entities are moving things from one place to another, connecting different parts of Ark's surface network. The routes they follow, the materials they transport, the destinations they move toward, all of this is intelligence that the raider community has worked to accumulate. And the picture that emerges from that intelligence is of a surface network with significant complexity and significant apparent purpose. The behaviours of Ark's entities at night, or under conditions of reduced visibility, are something that the raider community has observed carefully because these conditions affect the tactical calculation of surface operations. Ark's entities do not simply become less active in reduced light. They change their behavioural patterns in ways that are consistent but distinct from their daytime behaviour. Whether this reflects something about how Ark's entities perceive their environment, or whether it reflects some deeper rhythmic structure in Ark's surface operations, is an open question. The encounters between different types of Ark entities, the interactions within Ark's own system, are something that raiders occasionally observe and that the law treats as potentially significant. Most of Ark's entities seem to operate in coordination without apparent conflict, but there are occasional instances where entities of different types interact in ways that are ambiguous, that do not fit the simple model of a unified system operating in perfect coordination. Whether these ambiguities are meaningful or simply noise in the pattern is something the research community has not resolved. The question of whether Ark's entities have anything that could be described as awareness of or interest in individual human raiders, as opposed to simply responding to human presence as a category of environmental anomaly, is one that experienced raiders think about. The behavior of ARC's entities in close contact situations, when they are engaging with a specific human being in a specific moment, sometimes has qualities that make this question feel less simple than it might seem. Whether this impression reflects something real about ARC's entities, or is simply the pattern matching of a human mind trying to make sense of something alien, is not clear. The damaged or non-functioning ARC entities that raiders encounter and study are a significant source of information about ARC's design and capabilities. The ability to examine an ARC entity up close, to analyze its components and attempt to understand its design logic is one of the more direct routes to understanding what ARC is and how it works. The research community on Cayman has made real use of the entity components that raiders have retrieved, and this analysis has produced some of the more technically detailed lore around ARC's nature. The arc of ARC's entity development over time, from the arrival period to the game's present, is something the lore suggests has been one of development and elaboration. The entities present on the surface now appear to be more complex, more capable, and more varied than those of the earliest ARC period. Whether this represents ARC building towards something, improving its operational capability towards some goal, or simply the natural development of a system over time, is a question the lore raises without answering definitively. The emotional response that experienced raiders report to repeated encounters with ARC's entities is a dimension of the human experience of the surface that the lore captures in interesting ways. The entities are not simply abstract threats. They have presence, character in a functional sense. The particular behavioral qualities of individual entity types become familiar over time, and familiarity with something dangerous does not eliminate the danger, but it does change the psychological experience of confronting it. Veteran raiders describe their relationship to ARC's entities in terms that are complex, not quite respect, not quite fear, but something that contains elements of both. The scale of ARC's entity population on the surface, the total number of entities that are operating across the occupied territories, is something that no one in the game's world knows precisely. The raider community's observations cover a limited portion of the surface, and extrapolating from those observations to the full picture involves significant uncertainty. What is clear is that ARC has established a presence on the surface that is dense enough to make uncontrolled access to that surface effectively impossible for humans. Whatever ARC has built since its arrival, it has built it thoroughly. Chapter 7. The Intelligence. Question: is someone controlling ARC? This is the chapter the whole video has been building toward. Everything we have covered, the pre-ARC world, the arrival, the evacuation, the station communities, the raiders, the surface entities, all of it has been context for this question. And I want to be clear, again, that what follows is my reading of the available evidence, not a definitive statement of what the game's lore establishes as canon. The game deliberately leaves this question open. What I am doing is assembling the evidence and presenting the reading I find most compelling. The question of whether ARC has a directing intelligence is not new within the game's world. It has been a central debate in the research community since the early post-ARC period. The factions on the stations have different positions on it, positions that align to some degree with their broader beliefs and interests. And the raider community's direct experience of the surface has fed information into the debate without definitively resolving it. The evidence that points towards some form of directing intelligence in ARC's operations is significant. The purposefulness of ARC's surface activities, the coordination among its entities, the apparent optimization of its construction and processing operations towards some end, the selective incorporation of pre-ARC infrastructure into its own network. All of these things are more consistent with directed behavior than with simple mechanical process running without any guiding logic. The evidence that complicates the directing intelligence hypothesis is also real. Ark's behavior, even where it appears purposeful, does not map onto the kinds of purposes that a human mind would generate. The things Ark appears to be building, the processes it appears to be running, do not obviously serve any goal that humans would recognize as valuable or meaningful. If Ark has a directing intelligence, that intelligence's goals are not transparent from what its surface behavior shows us. The distributed nature of Ark's apparent intelligence, if it has one, is something the law points toward. Ark does not appear to have a single, central control point that could be identified and targeted. Its operations are distributed across the surface, and the coordination among its entities seems to happen through a network rather than through a hierarchy that has an obvious top. This distribution is one of the features of Ark that makes it both resistant to conventional military approaches and genuinely mysterious in terms of how it actually works. The possibility that Ark's intelligence, if it exists, is not located on Earth's surface at all is something the law raises. If Ark arrived from somewhere else, if it is an instance of something larger than what we can see on Earth, then the directing intelligence, if there is one, might be elsewhere. This reading would explain some of Ark's behaviors as the implementation of instructions from a source that is not locally observable, and it would place Ark's surface operations in a context that is much larger than the game's visible world. The question of whether Ark's apparent intelligence, assuming it exists, is something that humans could communicate with, is one that different factions have very different attitudes toward. Some rule it out entirely, on the grounds that Ark's behavior shows no sign of any form of communication intent. Others think communication may be possible, but that humans have not yet found the right medium or the right message. And some hold positions that are more speculative, involving the possibility that Ark has already been trying to communicate in ways that humans have not recognized as communication. The faction that takes most seriously the possibility of communicating with Ark is the one that the law presents as having the most scientific and research investment in understanding Ark's deeper nature. Their position is not naive optimism about what Ark would say if it could be communicated with. It is a more basic empirical position that understanding what Ark is, whether it has directing intelligence, and how that intelligence works, is the prerequisite for making any good decisions about how to respond to Ark's occupation of Earth. The faction that most strongly rejects the directing intelligence hypothesis takes a position that Ark is a system, a sophisticated and dangerous system, but a system without genuine intelligence, running on processes that appear purposeful because they have a consistent logic, not because there is anything home. Their argument is that attributing intelligence to Ark is a category error, projecting human cognition onto something that works according to entirely different principles. The faction that takes a middle position, acknowledging the evidence of complex coordinated behavior while refusing to commit to the language of intelligence, argues that the terms we are using to discuss the question, intelligence, purpose, control, are pre-Ark concepts that may not translate well to whatever Ark actually is. Their position is that the question itself may need to be reformulated before it can be answered. The Raider community's perspective on the intelligence question is diverse but tends toward a pragmatic orientation. For many Raiders, the academic debate about whether Ark has intelligence is less important than the practical question of understanding Ark's behavioral patterns well enough to navigate around them. But the most experienced Raiders, the ones who have spent the most time in the closest proximity to Ark's operations, often have opinions on the intelligence question that carry a specific kind of weight, because they are grounded in direct observation that no station-based researcher has access to. The specific surface observations that bear most directly on the intelligence question are some of the most compelling pieces of law in the game. There are Raider reports of Ark entity behaviors that are difficult to explain as purely mechanical process, Behaviours that seem to respond not just to the immediate situation, but to a broader context. Behaviours that suggest something like strategy rather than mere reaction. These reports are contested because they are dependent on the interpretation of the observer, but they are consistent enough across different raiders in different contexts to be worth taking seriously. The construction activity that ARC has been engaged in on the surface is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the directing intelligence hypothesis. The structures that ARC has built and the processes that seem to be running within them appear to be directed towards something. They are not random. They have a logic, even if that logic is not fully legible to human observers. The fact that ARC is building things, that it is doing so at scale and over an extended period, points towards something that has a goal and is working toward it. The processing of Earth's materials that ARC appears to be engaged in is another piece of evidence. ARC is sorting, refining, and transforming the material resources of the planet. This is not the behaviour of a system that arrived and then settled into a static occupation. It is the behaviour of a system that is doing something with what it finds, taking in raw material and producing something, even if what it is producing is not yet clear. That production orientation points toward purpose, and purpose points towards something that has a goal. The temporal patterns in ARC's surface activity are one of the less obvious but potentially significant pieces of evidence on the intelligence question. ARC's activity is not constant or uniform over time. There are periods of more intense activity and periods of less. There are apparent cycles in certain types of entity behaviour. Whether these temporal patterns reflect something like planning, an intelligent adjustment of priorities over time, or whether they are simply the output rhythms of a mechanical system, is something the law does not resolve. But they are there, and they are noticed. The way that ARC responds to the raider community's presence over time is a piece of evidence that the law handles carefully. ARC's entity behaviours in response to raider activity have, in some observations, seemed to adapt. Not just respond, but adapt in ways that suggest the incorporation of new information into whatever is driving ARC's surface operations. Whether this adaptation reflects intelligence learning or simply a mechanical system adjusting its parameters based on environmental feedback is difficult to determine. But the adaptation itself, if real, is significant. The absence of any evidence of communication intent from ARC is a counterpoint that the directing intelligence hypothesis has to account for. If there is an intelligence directing ARC's operations, it has made no apparent attempt to communicate with the human communities that it must be aware of. This absence of communication could mean several things. It could mean ARC has no intelligence capable of recognizing human presence as something to communicate with. It could mean ARC has no interest in communicating. It could mean ARC is communicating in a medium or modality that humans have not recognized as communication. None of these options is eliminable by the current evidence. The possibility that ARC's intelligence, if it exists, is not the kind of intelligence that has goals in the sense that humans have goals, is a reading that some of the more philosophically oriented researchers in the games world advocate for. Under this reading, ARC might have something that functions like intelligence without having anything that functions like intent in the human sense. It might be optimizing towards some state without that optimization being goal-directed in any purposive sense. This is a subtle distinction, and the law leaves room for it. The question of whether ARC could be stopped or negotiated with or redirected, if it does have directing intelligence, is one that the political factions on the stations have very different positions on. The factions that most strongly advocate for understanding ARC before taking action tend to be the ones that take the directing intelligence hypothesis most seriously. Their argument is that if there is an intelligence directing ARC, then any response strategy that does not account for that intelligence is potentially dangerous in ways that cannot be fully anticipated. The factions that advocate for more aggressive responses to ARC for trying to disrupt or damage Ark's surface operations rather than simply monitor and study them, tend to be more skeptical of the directing intelligence hypothesis, or to believe that even if Ark has intelligence, that intelligence is irrelevant to the question of what humans should do about the occupation of their planet. Their argument is that the occupation is the problem, and it needs to be addressed regardless of whether there is anyone home to negotiate with. The most specific and suggestive piece of law on the intelligence question, the piece that I think points most clearly toward one possible reading, is the evidence of something in Ark's operations that looks like long-range planning. The structures Ark has built, the processes it has established, the apparent trajectory of its surface activity over the years since its arrival, all point towards something that is working toward a state that does not yet exist. Something is being built. Whatever it is not yet complete. And the fact that Ark is still working, still adding to and refining its surface presence, suggests that whatever it is working toward has not yet been achieved. The implication of that long-range orientation is significant. If Ark is working toward something, if its current activities are steps toward a future state, then that future state is the thing that matters most for understanding what Ark is and what it means for humanity. The evidence of long-range planning, if that is what it is the strongest argument for directing intelligence in Ark's operations. Because long-range planning, the ability to organize current activities around a future goal that has not yet been reached, is one of the defining features of genuine intelligence rather than mere mechanical process. But here is where the reading gets complicated. Long-range planning could be a product of directed intelligence, in the sense we normally mean when we talk about intelligence, or it could be an emergent property of a sufficiently complex mechanical system, something that looks like planning because it has consistency and directionality without actually involving anything we would recognize as thought or intent. The distinction between these two possibilities is one that the game's law does not resolve, and I think that deliberate unresolution is one of the most interesting things about Ark Raiders as a piece of lore building. The answer to the question that titles this video, is Ark controlling the entire Earth, is almost certainly yes, in the simple sense that Ark's presence and its network of entities have established effective control over the surface of the planet. Humans cannot simply live on Earth. Ark determines who can be where and for how long, even if that determination operates through entity behavior and environmental hazard rather than through explicit decree. In that sense, Ark controls Earth. But the deeper question, the one the title is really pointing at, is whether there is a controller, a directing intelligence, something with will and purpose sitting behind Ark's occupation of the planet. And on that question, the lore gives us evidence, gives us competing readings, gives us the tools to think about it seriously, and then deliberately does not give us a definitive answer. Because the answer to that question is the thing that changes everything. And Ark Raiders, as a piece of lore building, seems to understand that keeping that question open is more powerful than closing it. The surface of Earth turns slowly below the orbital stations, marked and working, covered in the activity of something that humanity does not fully understand. The entities move with purpose through the landscapes of the old world. The construction continues. The processing continues. Whatever Ark is building, it is still building. Whatever it is working toward, it has not arrived there yet. And every day, the Raiders go down. They navigate through Ark's presence, extract what they can, observe what they see, and come back up. They are, in a very real sense, the eyes and hands of humanity in the closest proximity to whatever Ark is. And what they are learning, what they are bringing back, what they are reporting, is slowly, piece by piece, adding up to a picture that none of them can fully see yet. The picture is not complete. It may never be complete, or it may become complete all at once, in a single revelation that changes everything. The law does not tell us which. It gives us the evidence, the competing interpretations, the human drama of living with an extraordinary unknown, and it leaves us exactly where the characters in this world live every day, somewhere between knowing and not knowing, between the surface below and the stars above, between the world that was and whatever comes next. Chapter 8: The Factions, Who Has Power in the New World. The factions that operate in the post-Ark world are not simply political parties or competing corporations, though they have features of both. They are communities of shared belief and shared interest that have developed over the years of the post-Ark period in response to the specific demands and pressures of that period. Understanding them means understanding the stakes of the central debates in the game's world, because each faction is, in a fundamental sense, a different answer to the same question. What should humanity do about Ark? The faction landscape of the station world did not emerge fully formed from the chaos of the evacuation. It developed gradually through the crystallization of shared interests and shared beliefs into organized communities, through conflict and alliance and the pragmatic sorting out of who stood where on the questions that mattered most. The factions of the game's present are the end product of years of this process, and understanding where they came from helps make sense of what they are and what they want. The faction that most strongly emphasizes the military and operational response to Ark is one that has roots in the military and law enforcement communities of the pre-Ark world. Its culture reflects those origins, valuing hierarchy, discipline, operational effectiveness, and a clear-eyed assessment of Ark as a threat that needs to be managed and eventually eliminated rather than studied indefinitely. This faction has significant influence over the security and defense architecture of the station communities, and its relationship to the raider community is one of the most practically important factional relationships in the game's world. The operational faction's position on the intelligence question tends toward the skeptical. Whether or not Ark has directing intelligence, they argue, is less important than developing the capability to degrade its surface operations and eventually create conditions under which human return to Earth becomes possible. Their critics say this approach is dangerous precisely because it does not adequately account for what Ark might do in response to escalating human interference with its surface operations. The operational faction's response to this criticism is that waiting and studying indefinitely is itself a policy with costs that its proponents do not adequately acknowledge. The faction that most strongly emphasizes scientific understanding of Ark has roots in the research communities that survived the evacuation and continued their work in the station environment. Its culture values empirical rigor, intellectual honesty about the limits of current knowledge, and patience with the slow and uncertain process of building genuine understanding of something unprecedented. This faction has significant influence over the research institutions of the station world, and its relationship to the raider community is shaped by its dependence on raider intelligence about the surface. The research faction's position on the intelligence question is the most nuanced and in some ways the most honest. They take seriously both the evidence that points toward directing intelligence and the complications that resist any simple characterization of what Ark is. Their argument for prioritizing understanding over action is not that action will never be necessary, but that action, taken without adequate understanding, is likely to produce consequences that are worse than the current situation. Whether this argument is correct is not something the law settles. The faction that most strongly emphasizes the economic dimensions of the post-Ark situation has roots in the commercial and financial communities of the pre-Ark world. Its culture values efficiency, practical outcomes, and the management of the post-Ark situation as a set of resource allocation and economic organization problems. This faction has significant influence over the trade networks and commercial infrastructure of the station world, and its relationship to the raider community is the most transactional of the major factions. The commercial faction is sometimes characterized by its opponents as having compromised values, as being willing to accept the indefinite continuation of Ark's occupation of Earth as long as the station economy remains viable and growing. This characterization is not entirely fair, but it is not entirely unfair either. The commercial faction's priorities do tend to emphasize stability and economic function over the long-term goal of reclaiming Earth, because stability and economic function are what makes their particular power base work. The law does not endorse or condemn this prioritization. It simply presents it as a real orientation with real consequences. The faction that most strongly emphasizes the rights and interest of the raider community is one that has developed within the raider world itself, rather than being imported from the pre-Ark world's institutional landscape. Its culture is shaped by the specific values and experiences of the raider life, emphasizing direct experience, practical knowledge, autonomy, and a certain skepticism toward authority structures that have not earned their credibility through experience on the surface. This faction's influence in the broader station politics is limited but not negligible, and its relationship to the other major factions is complicated by its awareness of how much those factions depend on what raiders do. The raider faction's position on the intelligence question tends to be the most grounded in direct observation, even as it is the least theoretically articulate. Raiders who have spent time on the surface have views about Ark's nature that are shaped by what they have seen and experienced, and those views do not always align with what the research or operational factions would prefer them to believe. The raider faction's contribution to the intelligence debate is a form of testimony that carries weight precisely because it comes from people who have been there. The ideological fault lines between the major factions are real and consequential, but the law also shows how the faction's actual behavior is shaped by interests and pressures that sometimes cut across their stated positions. The operational faction sometimes partners with the research faction when the research in question has clear operational applications. The commercial faction sometimes supports the research faction when understanding Ark better promises to identify new extractable resources. The raider faction sometimes aligns with the operational faction when expanded operational capabilities would improve raider safety. The picture is messy in the way that real political landscapes are always messy. The smaller factions and informal communities that exist in the shadow of the major players add texture to the game's political landscape. Groups defined by their pre-Ark origin communities, by shared spiritual or philosophical frameworks, by specific technical specializations, by particular relationships to the question of Ark. These smaller groups do not have the influence of the major factions, but they are not irrelevant. In the right circumstances, the right smaller group in the right position can have disproportionate influence on specific outcomes. The factional politics on Cayman play out in spaces that range from the formally institutional to the intensely personal. Committee meetings and policy debates are one site of factional contest. Social gatherings and informal conversations are another. The alliances that form and dissolve between individuals who belong to different factions, the personal relationships that cross factional lines or that reinforce them, the small daily negotiations and accommodations that constitute the texture of factional coexistence, all of these are present in the law, and they make the political landscape feel alive rather than schematic. The role of information control in factional politics is something the game's law treats as a first-order concern. Each faction has an interest in controlling the information that circulates within its sphere of influence, in ensuring that its interpretation of events and evidence is the one that its members and potential allies encounter most readily. The struggle to define what is known and what is believed about Ark is as real a political contest as any more visible dispute over resources or governance structures. The relationship between factional politics and the raider profession is one of the most developed threads in the game's political law. Raiders operate in factional politics because they have to, because the resources and support they need are held by factional actors. But the raider community's direct experience of the surface gives individual raiders a form of authority that is not fully controlled by any faction, because it is grounded in something that factional politics cannot fully manage, which is what Ark actually does when you're standing in front of it. The specific factional history of Cayman, the sequence of power struggles and alliances and crises through which the current factional balance was reached, is one of the richer threads in the game's background lore. The current situation did not just appear, it is the result of specific events, specific decisions, specific people doing specific things for specific reasons. Understanding that history helps make the current situation legible in ways that simply observing the current balance of power does not. The factions' different positions on the question of long-term strategy for dealing with Ark are not simply ideological differences, though ideology is certainly part of it. They also reflect genuine uncertainty about what would actually work. Nobody knows with confidence what the right approach to Ark is. The factions are not simply different answers to a question whose correct answer is knowable. They are different bets on a question that nobody has definitively solved. This epistemic situation, where the disagreements between factions are partly about values and partly about genuine uncertainty, is one of the more intellectually honest aspects of the game's political lore. The factional competition for control of the research agenda is one of the most consequential, ongoing political contests in the game's world. What gets studied, with what resources, toward what ends, is not determined by the scientific community alone. It is determined through a political process in which factional interests play a major role. The research that gets done on Ark is partly a function of the current balance of factional power, and that means the state of human knowledge about Ark is partly a product of Cayman's politics. The relationship between the factions and the population of Cayman that does not strongly identify with any of them is something the lore attends to. Many of Cayman's residents are not deeply factional in their orientation. They have lives to live, work to do, families to take care of. The factional politics are something they are aware of and affected by, but not something they are primarily defined by. The lore takes care not to reduce Cayman's population to a collection of factional representatives. The non-factional majority is a political fact in its own right, a constituency that the factions compete for and that periodically exerts influence on the political landscape in ways that are not fully controlled by any faction. The generational dimension of factional politics is something the lore develops with care. The older generation of factional leaders, people who were adults during the evacuation and who built their careers and identities in the early post-Ark period, have a different relationship to the foundational questions than the younger generation who grew up with those questions as settled background rather than urgent open issues. The transition between these generations is happening in the game's present, and it is changing the character of factional politics in ways that are not fully predictable. The role of charismatic individual leadership in factional politics is something the lore acknowledges alongside the more structural analysis of factional interests. Individual personalities matter. The specific people who lead factional organizations and who serve as their public faces shape those organizations in ways that go beyond what the structural interests alone would predict. The personal histories, the specific beliefs, the individual relationships of factional leaders are factors in how their factions behave and how the factional landscape develops. The question of factional legitimacy, the basis on which each faction claims the right to influence decisions that affect everyone, is one that the lore raises without settling. Different factions have different legitimacy claims. The operational faction claims legitimacy on the basis of its responsibility for security and defense. The research faction claims legitimacy on the basis of its expertise and its contribution to understanding ARC. The commercial faction claims legitimacy on the basis of its management of the economic systems that keep everyone alive. The raider faction claims legitimacy on the basis of its direct experience of the surface. Each claim has real foundation. None of them is simply the whole story. The factional dynamics around the treatment of ARC-related discoveries, what happens when a raider or a researcher comes across something genuinely new about ARC, are some of the most dramatically interesting elements of the political law. A genuinely significant discovery about ARC is a political event as well as a scientific one. How it is interpreted, who controls the narrative around it, what implications are drawn from it, and by whom, all of these are factional contests as much as they are empirical questions. The faction's approaches to the radar equipment development industry are significantly different, and these differences have real consequences for what equipment is developed, who has access to it, and how it is priced. The operational faction tends to favor equipment that enhances combat capability against ARC's entities. The research faction favors equipment that enhances the ability to observe and collect data without engagement. The commercial faction favors equipment that maximizes extraction efficiency. The raider faction advocates for equipment that keeps individual raiders alive across the widest range of situations. These different emphases pull the equipment development industry in different directions. The underground networks and informal power structures that operate outside the formal factional system are a feature of Cayman's political landscape that the law acknowledges. Not everything that matters politically happens through the major factions. There are networks of personal loyalty and obligation that cut across factional lines. There are informal economies that operate outside the commercial faction's management. There are communities of shared experience and identity that create solidarity across factional divisions. The full picture of who has power and how it is exercised on Cayman is more complex than the factional map alone reveals. The violence that factional competition occasionally produces is something the law treats as a real and recurring feature of the post-ARC political landscape, not an aberration. Factional competition can become intense enough to produce sabotage, coercion, and occasionally direct physical violence. The security structures of Cayman exist partly to manage this violence, and the history of when those structures have succeeded and when they have not is a thread in the station's political history. The relationship between factional politics on Cayman and the political dynamics of the other stations is complex. Each station has its own factional landscape, with its own dominant players and its own characteristic debates. The major Cayman factions have counterparts and allies on other stations, and the politics of the station network as a whole is partly a function of these interstation factional relationships. Understanding Cayman's politics fully requires understanding where it fits in the larger political network of the orbital human community. The cultural production that the different factions sponsor or encourage tends to reinforce their particular worldviews and their particular readings of the ARC situation. The stories that the operational faction favors are stories of human courage and effective action against ARC's threat. The stories that the research faction favors are stories of patient intellectual work and the gradual uncovering of difficult truth. The stories that the commercial faction favors are stories of resourcefulness and economic ingenuity in difficult conditions. These narrative preferences are not trivial. They shape the cultural environment of Cayman in ways that have political effects. The factional competition for the loyalty of the next generation of Cayman residents is one of the most important long-term contests in the game's political landscape. The young people who are currently growing up on Cayman will be the dominant political actors in a generation. Each faction is aware of this and is invested in the cultural and educational processes through which those young people develop their values and political identities. The outcome of this competition will shape the factional landscape of the future in ways that cannot be fully predicted from the current situation.